I know a lot of sessions go on having to do with responsive, and they take you through like theming and the code and all those things. I didn't want to do that. I didn't want it to be very code heavy. What I wanted to do was sort of walk through some of the resources that you would want to encounter, solutions for various things. And then also know I've got a lot of slides in the presentation, but this isn't technically, my goal isn't to get through slides. We can actually have an active discussion if you have questions, or if I'm saying something and you want clarity on it, or even if you have something to add, feel free to interrupt me and share with the group, and we can kind of sort of have a conversation as we're going through this presentation. So to start, does anyone have any questions about responsive web design in general, or any input on what you're hoping to learn with responsive, or any insight about responsive web design? Okay, great. So let's start the walk. Again, my name is David Plutato-Fugate. @Plutato is my Twitter handle. Plutato is my Drupal ID. You can reach me at david@davidfugate.com. Currently, I work in Manhattan, in New York, at a place called Elephant Ventures. I'm the Principal Experience Engineer. I'm also a Scrum Master, and I'm the newly promoted Knowledge Creation Czar. I only started there a few months ago, actually 2 months ago. My past experience includes primarily developing media sites. I've worked at CNN, Time Inc., NBC Universal, Turner Sports, Morris Communications, which is a newspaper company, University of North Carolina, and then some boutique Drupal shops. I also live here in Minneapolis. I actually just signed a lease last week. I have a wife and a daughter who's 6 months old. So I'm very new and learning my way around the city, which is very nice. Prior to maybe a month ago, the only time I was here was when I was meeting my wife's family and getting married. And that was 2 years ago. So today we'll cover, and not in this order, but we'll try to cover key concepts for responsive web design. Oftentimes you'll see RWD, and that means responsive web design. We'll talk about some tools you can use. We'll talk about some approaches that you can use. Hopefully we'll go through some of my delightful opinions, and we can talk about your delightful opinions. After this talk, you can go to github/plutato/walkthrough-rwd. You'll see that this repo is actually empty at the moment. I created it last night with the intention that after the talk, once I get feedback and all of those things, I'll actually put up all the links that I share. Any feedback that you guys give me about links and resources, I'll also put those up. And then aspirationally, maybe we'll have sort of like a pattern library or best cases that we can sort of build off of after this talk. So let's start. In general, the internet is a medium. It's a medium in the same way that radio is a medium, television is a medium, and print is a medium. So the internet and responsive web design have only been out for a couple of years, so we're still sort of working our way around it. There's a lot of decisions that are sort of being made, and we're having to train ourselves off of, well, having to basically teach ourselves and realize that it is in fact a new medium. So my undershirt is a medium. The medium is still evolving, of course. The presentation is still evolving. And I'll obviously check the repo after today, check it on Sunday, and I'll have all the links that are basically demonstrated here. So the basic purpose of every medium, in my view, is basically to present narratives from a distinct point of view. Everything that you consume in medium is essentially, in media is essentially some aspect of storytelling. Someone's communicating something to you, they're selling something to you, they're, you know, if you're interested in learning about culture and narratives, this is an aside, there's a documentary called Century of Self, a 4-part series. It's pretty fantastic. Has nothing to do with web design, but it does talk about how we went from talking about things in terms of functionality and utility, like how long things lasted and how pragmatic it was to have things, to sort of an identity-based, where it was about status and things like that. So every medium has its own prevalent characteristics. You can't watch movies on radio. You can't listen to a magazine. If you could do any of those things, the medium or the definition of those mediums would change. So in a like fashion, Photoshop was a print design tool that basically ushered in this revolution of desktop publishing. But it is for print, it is for magazines, it is for things that people typically distribute out. And you shouldn't use it for responsive web design. Now, there's a battle, and I've worked for a lot of media companies in which that's actually what everyone got trained for. They're decades in, and they're quite talented designers, better designers than I am. So you can't really fight that fight. You can't tell designers that don't use Photoshop, because generally speaking, they're number one. They are designers, they use Photoshop. And the different departments and the business suite has a certain methodologies that they use. So usually they're using like waterfall, meaning that they actually design all this stuff and create business rules before it even gets to you as a developer. So someone with an idea will come to you with a site, and they usually have a good idea in mind, and sometimes they have designs. If that's the case, let's face it, Photoshop happens. There's a couple tools that you can use. There's a thing called Adobe Edge Reflow. There's another tool called Webflow that you can use. It helps you basically translate, or in the case of the Adobe product, because Photoshop is also an Adobe product, you can actually very easily convert a Photoshop document into something that is responsive, and it gives you a better idea of how it translates. And if you guys wanted to talk a second about the reason why Photoshop doesn't work, is because Photoshop is basically a static design, and responsive isn't that. Oftentimes what people will give you is they'll give you the magical breakpoints in Photoshop. So they'll want to say, this is what the design looks like at 320 pixels. This is what it looks like at 768, which is what a lot of tablets are. And then this is what it looks like at the biggest breakpoint. But what happens with designers is oftentimes they're not designing in the medium. That they're basically using a print product to design for the web. And they don't have the insight when they're designing at the smallest. If you compare the smallest design to the largest design, what ends up happening is oftentimes they take that smallest design as an opportunity to make a great 320 pixel wide design, but it isn't actually informed entirely by the large design. They'll change the assets, they'll change the order of the structure of things in the DOM, new elements will come in. So wherever possible, it's best to actually design and develop in the medium that you're building for. So when you do your designs and your product is going to be viewed in a browser on any various device, then let's try to design in the browser. So let's keep in mind, and I don't know if you guys attended the last talk, the keynote, but that was pretty fantastic, right? What's going to happen to Drupal. So in the same way, responsive web design is our current favored methodology for web design. Just a couple years ago, it was something else. We basically emulated, essentially, when the web started, everything was fluid. People had 100% width, and we had our 640 pixel wide browsers with our small monitors, and then magazines became popular. When magazines became popular, they said, let's take all this great stuff from magazines and put it on the web. So we ended up with using Photoshop, Fireworks. We would use what's the Adobe software that was very popular for a while? We used to use Microsoft Front Page, and then we used Dreamweaver. Yeah. And we would try to make the websites look like the magazines, right? So as these devices and as technology changes, we're now in the current state of web design, which is responsive. It's favored so much, in fact, that Google has actually officially said that this is the preferred methodology that we want for presenting websites, that no matter what device that you're on, we want the same elements, the same sort of source code, the same DOM structure for each, regardless of what device that you're using. So at some point, I think we'll no longer even say responsive web design. We'll simply say it's web design. Most of the new sites that are coming out now have a requirement to be responsive, and it's sort of assumed. However, keep in mind, like the last presentation, that some other methodology or approach may arise that we don't see, or that I don't see, that better help us tell stories or better help us build websites that are narrative and easy to understand and useful, and more so, or maybe even in addition to what responsive web design does now. Two of those concepts, REST, which is responsive web design with server-side components, and then there's another methodology which sometimes people place them against each other, adaptive web design. So let's talk about the differences. Well, first let's go back. So Fluid is where we started before we were even building beautiful sites. The first sites that we ever created were all Fluid. And Fluid essentially means that when we were determining how something would look on the screen, we were just using percentages. Something would be 50% of the screen, and then if there was another, like if there was, something would be maybe 75% on the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand side it would be 25%, and we would float it. And you would take the browser, and if you wanted to squeeze it, you would see everything just sort of get smaller as you were squeezing. That was Fluid. And then we decided that didn't look so great, and we decided, well, adaptive should be the way. So adaptive is interesting in that there's two concepts, there's two phrases that are very popular in web design, and it's unfortunate that we weren't creative as an industry to pick a new word for it. So adaptive in web design has two meanings, and the term mobile first also has two meanings. So adaptive used to actually hark back to where we were talking about accessibility. You'd have a web browser that you were viewing on your desktop, and it was fully functional, and you could see all of the great things. Before the era of smartphones, we used to have these web-enabled phones. And it used to be that we would use a concept called progressive enhancement, in which we would say, if you're on your desktop computer, you can see certain things. Maybe you're able to view JavaScript and things like that. But if you're on one of these web-enabled phones, before the era of smartphones, we should use adaptive or progressive enhancement approaches to where you can at least see the content, the text, the copy, and all of that stuff on the phone, even if it's not enabled with Flash or enabled with JavaScript and all of those things. So, but now in our current use of the term adaptive, we actually mean something different. We're no longer talking about progressive enhancement. What we're talking about adaptive as it relates to the current state of the industry is adaptive is essentially not something that's fluid, but rather you choose, like as a business rule, I want to have a site and I want to have set breakpoints or set widths for the site to be presented in. So at the smallest presentation of the site, it's going to be 480 pixels wide. And it doesn't have to be responsive because all of the elements inside of that breakpoint are basically set. I can use fixed widths and fixed assets for everything. And then there's going to be another size that I want, which will be 768. So if I'm viewing it on an iPad, I know that that's going to be 768 pixels wide, and this is how it'll look. So you're basically creating very hard rules for each of the breakpoints. But adaptive and responsive are similar in the fact that they both use media queries, which we'll get to. So responsive is different in the fact that it does, and one of the characteristics of adaptive is that when you're on a site and you're actually squeezing the browser, it has this sort of snapping mentality. You never actually hit the margins of the site. It just sort of snaps into place. That's one of the ways that you can tell immediately if something's responsive or if something's adaptive. Responsive is not adaptive. It actually is, the point of responsive is that it should be optimized for the platform that you're using at any resolution. It's not meant to favor certain resolution sizes. It should actually look great on any device, any platform, regardless of what the resolution might be. So the way that we make adaptive and responsive work, as opposed to the way fluid worked, which was just percentages, is that we introduced this concept of media queries. Media queries is basically just something that happens in CSS, where we tell the browser that at certain widths, we want properties of certain elements to change. This is a traditional media query. I think I have a pointer here. So essentially the media query is saying that if the browser is medium width 48 ems, which is, if you use a base pixel size of 16, a base font size of 16, this essentially means that this is, what is that? That's 768? Yeah. So basically, here's the media query. It begins here, it ends here, and then inside of it, we're actually saying that there's an element with the class of element, and we want the font size to be 1.2. And then when the screen is a little bit larger, we want it to be 1.4. If you have any experience in responsive web design, it gets a little bit messy quite quickly. You will decide that you're going to have sort of these breakpoints, and you're going to have a lot of elements that are sort of in this, and you have a really, so you'll have basically a media query and a ton of elements that you're styling for within those, and you get tired of scrolling after a while because you have like 10 different. So there's another methodology that you can use, which is nested, which is essentially, let's throw out the idea of like media queries as our first concern. Let's think about the content first on like an element level. Like if you have a header tag, an H1 tag, and that changes sizes, as you get more narrow or more large, let's just look at that thing as an element. And let's say what it will be generally speaking, right? We want that to sort of be the base. And then let's actually nest the media queries inside of the element. And it works. So that's the difference between traditional and nested. Of course, media queries is what makes things adaptive or responsive. That's sort of the magic. So breakpoints. Breakpoints is the way that we refer to the main sort of targets that we have when we're doing responsive web design. There's also a concept that isn't as popular, but it's called tweakpoints. So when you're building a media site and you're dealing with business people or people that have certain devices, and when they're telling you what their business requirements are, they're going to say, well, I want this to look great in an iPad. I want this to look great in my iPhone. All of these have certain pixels, and sometimes they're sophisticated enough to say, okay, well, I want my breakpoints to be 480 pixels. I want it to be 768 pixels. I want a 1024, and the maximum is going to be, 1080 pixels. So they tell you what the breakpoints are. So I've worked in environments where they insisted on all of the breakpoints or all the media queries as you're basically developing them can only sort of exist in those breakpoints. So meaning that when you have your style sheet, you should really only have those declarations that are sort of adhering to those breakpoints. I think that that's not a good idea. I think it's a good idea to have major breakpoints, but then within those breakpoints and those ranges of breakpoints, you should be able to treat the content as the highest priority, and you should have tweak points. I didn't make up the word tweak points. You could look it up, and there's other people sort of contributing to the conversation regarding breakpoints and tweak points. In fact, you could go to a good place, and there's a nice conversation that's happening at Brad Frost's web, 7 Habits of Highly Effective Media Queries. He goes through some of the arguments about using breakpoints, tweakpoints, and then other ideas evolving around responsive web design and media queries. So here's a few things that you'll want to consider, and there's a couple slides we'll also return to the idea of breakpoints in just a moment. You want to consider using normalize.css. Essentially, normalize, there's several flavors of normalize. So normalize is a popular one, but the first one that we were using a few years ago was a thing called reset CSS by Eric Meyer. Normalize does the same thing, and then there's another one that's developed by Yahoo, which is also a reset. But the idea of normalize.css is that you basically have a very small condensed CSS file that establishes properties where the CSS is essentially treated the same across the major browsers. So there's going to be differences between using IE and Chrome and Firefox and Opera. Normalize sort of tries to equal the playing field so that when you begin to write CSS properties in your style sheets, that as long as normalize is being read by the browser, that it'll pick up. You'll also want to consider picking up a thing called HTML5 Boilerplate. Personally, I don't use HTML5 Boilerplate, but I do, at the very least, use the doc type in the code. And by that I mean that in the doc type of the HTML5 boilerplate, you'll actually see that there's some conditional statements there. It's actually saying if this browser is less than IE7 or less than IE8, or if it has no JavaScript, that these things are basically be classes that you can target in your CSS to sort of treat the edge cases when you're building a site. There's another tool that helps you to do this as well, but this is a great place to start if you're building the base HTML file. Omega, which is a contributed theme in Drupal, also does this by default, and it would be a pretty good place to start if you're building a responsive Drupal site and are looking for this. Some other themes do that as well. I think the Aurora theme does that as well. So the viewport meta tag. So in the head of your document, you're going to have basically meta tags. One of the important ones is called viewport. Basically, the declaration that's being made here is that they want the initial scale to be 1, the maximum scale to be 1, the minimum scale to be 1. That essentially means that if you're viewing it in like a touch device or a tablet or something like that, that however you develop the site, it's going to show at basically the value of 1. It's not going to be able to be pinchable and zoomable in these touch devices. Modernizer. So as I showed in the doc type here, this is basically provides you some classes that you can grab if the conditions are met in your CSS file. Modernizer is similar to that in that if you install Modernizer, it will allow you to do feature detection, and it'll show up basically in the head or around certain elements on your site where it'll tell you basically if the site or the device you're viewing the site in is touch enabled, is a mobile device, has certain capabilities. So, and I'll actually go back and show you what the sites look like as well, so that when you visit them after, you'll recognize them. So if you're supporting IE, I don't know if you guys got the news report, but yesterday they decided finally, well, there's two things. So Microsoft decided that they're now going to be an agile organization. They're going to make this huge structural, cultural shift. They're going to move from waterfall methodology to agile. So within that same mindset, they decided that They're going to officially not support IE8 in January 2016. Right? How's that for Agile? It's going to take 2 years to no longer support a browser that shouldn't be supported now. So HTML5 Shiv will allow an old browser, or will enable an old browser to recognize some of these HTML5 elements. By HTML5 elements, I mean that if you have an element that's an article tag or an aside or some of these things that are a little bit newer, HTML5 Shiv will allow you to do that. Respond and the media queries, the two on the bottom there, these essentially will allow I think IE7 and up to use media queries. Older browsers actually weren't able to be responsive because they didn't actually recognize these media queries. They just wouldn't pick them up. So you'll probably need some sort of thing like that, a polyfill. So there's been an ongoing conversation for a long time about mobile first. The way that we can make sure that our devices work is that we start from the smallest presentation of a device and then work our way up. Also, mobile first predates responsive web design in that it actually used to be a term relevant to progressive enhancement, which essentially is the same as saying, well, mobile first means that we should develop the site so that we're able to view it in the least capable devices first, and then we progressively enhance so the most sophisticated stuff is the stuff that you work on last. The most basic stuff is the stuff that you work on first. In my philosophy, I say forget mobile first. Number one, we should have done a better job as an industry of picking a better term. We shouldn't have used the same phrase that we were using when we were talking about progressive enhancement. And on the other hand, most platforms are now mobile, but these mobile platforms that we're using, these devices, have incredible resolution, and they're no longer any different than I have devices that I can use in my hand that have just as high a resolution as my desktop computer does. So what is mobile? How do we approach it? What does this phrase mean now? If you go to a site called Screen Sizes, you'll see all of the different widths, and they're all over the map. That's for cell phones, iPads. So anyways, how should we approach it? How should we think about it? We should think content first. Isn't that what matters, the content? The way that I think about it is that we should mark up the most fundamental content layout, the wrappers for the content first. And we should think about it in a certain order. We should first think about content, right? Then we should think about components, meaning sort of the thing that's wrapping all of the elements involved with that piece of content, you know, the immediate structure around it. And then we should think about the rows that content lives in. And the reality is if you're building a website, most of the time you're going to get designs and you're going to get wireframes, you're going to get business documents, you're going to get PDFs and all of these different things. And the most prevalent representation that's going to be delivered to you that you have no control over are all these sort of full width things. If you're given that and you don't want to fight the battle and say, no, I'm not going to start unless you give me the mobile first, then start thinking about it in terms of content first. Figure out what the most important content is on the site. Figure out all the supporting content, meaning that the most important content on most sites is going to be anything in the article element. And then you're either going to have a sidebar and a side if you're using HTML5, and you want to sort of think about, you know, what am I going to do with that in relation to the content. So, and of course, you want to start thinking about that stuff in the wireframing stage before you write any code. It's actually just as relevant to just write on a whiteboard or use paper and pen to say, here's where all the content is. This is essentially the div structure that I'm going to use. And then as soon as you've figured out the div structure, you can just begin squeezing and expanding the browser, you know, a million times. pretty quickly. So it's also important to get organized in your styles because media queries have the tendency to get pretty messy pretty quickly. So you're not going to have a site where you have one style sheet. You're probably going to have many style sheets, and you have to name your style sheets in a way that's like humanly understandable or easy for other developers to work with you. So there's some concepts that you'll probably want to look at and you'll want to choose between. There's object-oriented CSS, which was, I think, the first one out of the gate, the first developer that was sort of beginning the conversation. There's a thing called BIM, and I mention it because Drupal 8 in general is advocating BIM. BIM is developed by the developers that created the popular Russian search engine called Yandex. And as a framework, it actually is pretty complicated. The CSS side is less complicated. All it essentially means is that when you're naming the CSS classes, you're using dashes or underscore, and either using 2 dashes or using 2 underscores will represent if something's being modified or if something's another variation of an element. But I won't go into that. There is some helpful links there. So Smax is also a popular one that was developed by I think Jonathan Snook. He worked for Yahoo and was developing Yahoo Mail back in the day, and in the same way essentially has a way of organizing CSS. So, and if we could talk about it for a moment, when I'm building websites in Drupal, my structure is essentially that you're going to have a theme, and in the theme you're going to have well, I'll flash forward, and so I don't have to talk about SASS right at the moment. So when I have my theme, I'm going to have a directory that has the style sheets in it, and that style sheet. So there's going to be certain levels of style sheets that you're going to have. You're going to have the global styles. You're going to have the normalized styles, and then you're going to have a directory in which you're going to have what's the concept known as partials. So I have a components directory, and when you click into the components directory, you're going to see basically a series of partials. Those partials are going to be named things like header, footer, events, event listing, article. So you can sort of get my point that you've got a CSS file or a style sheet that addresses each of these things. And then beyond that, when you're looking at it on the prototyping stage, and you're trying to see what styles are shared, if you have certain elements that are shared across different content types, then you're going to want to consider putting those in a more global place, in which if you're using something like SASS, you want to consider putting those into what's known as a mix-in. So all the shared styles can go into this little blocks of code to where when you need them for the content types, you just have to include the mix-in. And so it'll just be one line of code in each of your partials, but then you have another file that basically holds all of those global styles. So let's talk about a combination of different tools. All of these are very closely related. SASS is a CSS preprocessor, and by preprocessing it simply means that it interprets, you write in SASS and it interprets that, and it basically compiles it and spits it out in CSS. Compass is a tool that allows you to compile that. Scout basically works in tandem with Compass and SASS, and if you don't like using the command line, then Scout is basically a great application that you can download and use, and you basically have a graphical interface that you can use. And then Bundler is a way that you can compile a lot of themes, or if you're working with a development team, there'll be dependencies, there'll be different SASS mix-ins, and there'll be different plugins that you'll need, and Bundler will be able to compile those for you. That's not a lot of great information in terms of explanation, but you can go to the links. I'll also provide these links in the GitHub repo in the next day or so, so that you can look at those resources. And then I'll also go through the tabs to show you what the websites look like. So let's talk for a moment about rapid prototyping tools. I was recently developing a responsive website, and we had all the business rules. We had the PSDs, we had PNGs for mockups, and we decided, well, it has sliders, it has all the different things, so let's just jump in and do it with Drupal. Well, that's a bad mistake. You shouldn't, when you're able, the best practice is to have multiple methodologies. One thing that you should always have is a style guide, which basically is a in-browser representation of how everything is supposed to look in terms of font sizes, font families. If you can have sort of the components broken down so that you can show how things look on an individual, like on an element basis. You want to know how like form elements are going to look, how buttons are going to look, what the color scheme is, and all that stuff should be represented in a browser rather than a PSD. And then if you have some of these jQuery, these sort of content sliders, these sort of interactive and fancy things, you probably don't want to just jump in and use Drupal first. What you probably should do is just use straight HTML, CSS, mark it up in an HTML document, pull in the JavaScript library or write whatever custom code you need, and make sure that it works in very simple, straightforward HTML and CSS before you jump into the complexity of using Drupal, installing it, finding the contrib modules and all those things, and then hoping that the contrib module is going to match your business rules, because oftentimes it won't. Many times you'll have to either fork it or you'll have to create your own. It's often better and easier and faster and more effective to rapidly prototype something so that it works in a browser. You can present this to the client, and that becomes the initial feedback loop before you jump in and begin doing the real Drupal build. So here's some frameworks that I favor. Now there's about 1 million different CSS frameworks out there. Here are some of the more popular ones. Foundation is a popular one. Bootstrap, or it used to be known as Twitter Bootstrap. Now it's just Bootstrap is a popular one. And I put Gumby up there because I like it. Gumby is actually a fork of the Zurb Foundation framework, but it's quite nice. The sites for those is Gumby Framework, Zurb, and getbootstrap.com. There has been an idea floated out there that some of these grids are getting kind of old and it's probably not the way, and we should look at things on a more row level in terms, and instead of looking at it in terms of like an actual grid. So Foundation and Gumby and Bootstrap are great because if you know CSS and you understand that syntax, then it's sort of easy to make the jump. There's other ones. Let me return to semantic versus non-semantic. There's some other more sophisticated CSS prototyping tools that you could use, and those include Susy, Singularity, ZenGrids. These have an alternative syntax that you'll have to wrap your head around. And it's worth making the jump once you get there, but if you haven't done it before, then I would suggest starting with Gumby, Foundation, or Bootstrap, and then once you've built one site with those, then move on to Susy, Singularity, or ZenGrid so that you can both learn with the context of having built with the other system, but then also learning with the understanding of the differences and the advantages once you jump in to using this, which is actually it takes a different mindset. It's a different mental approach when you're using either one of these. So semantic versus non-semantic, one of the criticisms about responsive web design and using some of these CSS grids is that oftentimes, and forgive me, I don't actually have a screenshot of what the what it looks like, but if you've ever used one of these grids and you look in the source code, you'll actually see it say like 2 columns, 4 columns, etc., and it doesn't actually. So if you're looking at a div and the div says, say, div, I don't know, feature news, that's the class. And then inside of that content, it's actually a featured news item. That's more semantic. It actually tells you what the purpose of that wrapper is. Non-semantic is where you have these grid systems that you use and you implement, and the only information you get about what the grid is a presentational class. It says that it's 4 columns right beside one that's 8 columns. And it's just like, but that doesn't tell me what's in. That's not a content first idea. That's just a presentational rule. So there's arguments about that because people say, well, if you're looking at Google SEO, Google's not looking at semantic versus non-semantic as long as you're using, H tags, and they don't look at. Google looks on the element level. Are you using aside? Are you using footer, header? Are you using article? Do you have the H tags in the right order? Do you have one H tag and followed by, an H2, and then you've got H3s and all the precedences are correct? They don't look at the classes that you have on your divs. I don't know if that's true or not. But I prefer to do semantic, and if you're using one of these frameworks, to be truthful, it's great using them to rapidly prototype, but once you want to change these from being non-semantic to semantic, which is completely possible, you do have to do another step, and it becomes there's a little bit of a workflow if you're working with a team. If you have a class that essentially says that something's 4-column wide, and you want to change that 4-column to actually be featured news, in your style sheet you're going to have to include featured news to inherit what the value of the 4-column class. But if you're working with a team, they actually have to take the extra step. They have to go in the style sheet and say, well, what does featured news mean? How many columns is that? So by the time you change something and using these grid systems to something that's semantic, it does take a lot of, it does actually increase the complexity of the work. So let's go back to the idea of breakpoints versus slices. Breakpoints are the sort of large target areas, the 768, the 480, the 1020. And there's another idea of slices. We'll actually look at a grid and sort of see what we're talking about here. So on the top, these are breakpoints. You've got 400, 600, 800, 1050. Those are the major breakpoints. So there's an idea of maybe we should use slices in our syntax and not necessarily think of it in terms of 400, 600, 800, or 1050, but we should think of it as the space between those breakpoints as being the slice. So we would have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 slices, and we would refer to in our styles, we would essentially refer to those slices when we were declaring them. So you would say @2 would be equivalent to the breakpoint syntax. Now this breakpoint syntax, if you're not familiar with it, I should have done a better job of explaining it. So breakpoints in CSS as a media query uses the resulting. This is what it would look like in your CSS file. There's another thing called breakpoints, which is a SASS mix-in. So if you're using SASS and Compass, this is the syntax that you would use. You would use this syntax here. But the slice usage seems to be a little more intuitive and maybe easier to understand. The resulting query is exactly the same. So the point of that is, however you can more easily wrap your mind around it as an individual developer, but then also as a team, what seems to be the best path forward. So let's talk about style guides, design patterns, and the kitchen sink. You have several examples. I'll actually go into the browser and show you these. Style guides. So this is an example of the Zerb Foundation style guide. You can see that at the top they have an example of alert boxes. They show what grids look like how their breadcrumbs look, how their buttons look, and so on and so forth. So they show how the forms, how different drop downs will look. Oh, I don't want to do that. So when you're presenting this, or when you're working with a group, it's great to have something to refer back to. Everyone knows what the font weights will be, what the buttons will look like, and all of those things. These things are not put into a baked-in template that actually shows how like your front page would look or an article page would look. This is something where you would want to refer to when building those things, to make sure you're using the same classes across the site and all of those things. Immensely helpful. If you're not doing it currently, you should definitely do it. Obviously, if you're not using Foundation, then there's other ways that you can go. You can go to the Style Guide Boilerplate, or you can just look on Google and look for style guides, but these are nice ones to start with. There's a popular one that was developed by the Phase 2 guys, I believe. I could be wrong about that, called Style Tiles. Same concept. And then you have one called Pattern Lab, which I mentioned because we have a big fan of Pattern Lab here. But same concept. In principle, you basically want to go to your business users or the sales department or whoever your boss is, and you want to say, this is how everything's going to look. Here's the style guide, and I'm presenting it to you in the browser. So when we cobble together, we piece together, we develop these landing pages and these individual content type pages. These are all the style elements that we'll be taking from. And they'll match, the font weights, the font families, and all of those things will be accurate representations of. All right, so back to the keynote. Also, there's some interesting thoughts on outdated design patterns. This is sort of a controversial topic, and in many ways, I think it's designed to merely push the envelope, because a lot of these things are still quite popular. So how can they be outdated, right? So essentially, there's an idea that carousels and large backgrounds and mega menus and using text and images should be frowned upon. Most of which, those are things that I agree with, but they are in fact controversial to a lot of people. But do read those interesting thoughts. So there's good Drupal themes to start with, and this is just my opinion. I don't know how many Drupal themes there are out there, but there's probably several hundred. Omega being my favorite. Aurora, for those of you that like to use Singularity. Zen is something I've used on many occasions, and I have mixed feelings about it. It uses a lot of relative positioning. And anyway, so Bootstrap, if you're already using if you're already using the Bootstrap as your prototyping tool, then you may want to use it as the theme. And then Zerb Foundation. Of course, as you've done a lot, if you get used to doing a lot of sites, or if you're actually doing a really great rapid prototype, it's also a good idea to say, well, let me just forego using the Omega theme, because it has a lot of cruft and add-ons and all these different things. If I have a working rapid prototype and all the HTML markup, CSS, and all the JavaScript libraries, jQuery libraries are there, let me just convert that into a custom theme, and I'll almost be home free. So you have to use your best judgment in that regard. So for responsive images meaning that if you have this need that you have this huge picture on a landing page and it goes across the entire width of the browser, and you're on a pretty big screen, you have to ask the question, well, when I'm on a mobile device, is this picture going to be that large? Is it going to be the same picture? You don't want it to be the same picture. You want the platform that you're using or the device that you're using to download the correct size image. So there's a few different modules that you should use. The picture modules, the breakpoint modules. So this is in Drupal 7. In Drupal 8, I believe they're already built in. They're not contrib module, so that's definitely sort of the official sanctioned. I, of course, added the idea of using manual crop in combination with these, because I've had cases where when clients upload a large image and you have those breakpoints, they actually want to have input into how those individual sized pictures are cropped. Sometimes if it's a wide photo when it's large, as it gets smaller, you want to get closer to the face of the subject on the picture, so you could use manual crop to do that. There's a great YouTube video at one of the other conferences, Drupal, one of the previous Drupal camps, at that link. It's not my video, it's someone else, but it's a great instruction, because to do this, we use a thing called Drupal we use features in all of our development, and to be able to upload an image, to create an image field inside of a content type, and then configure it so that it uses picture and uses breakpoints, there's about 50 steps to do it. So, and you'll want to basically wrap your head around the fact that if you create an image field, the display of that image field has to be changed from image to picture. And then when you're using picture, you have to have both a breakpoint set sort of associated with it, and then also a picture configuration, so that Drupal knows which sizes to show. Anyways, this video will show you how to do that. Other great tools, there's a thing called fit text. There's another thing called fit vid. These basically work the same as one another. Let me see if I actually have them here. I don't. So fit text basically allows you to squeeze things, and then it stays within. Of course, this is JavaScript and it's handling text. You may feel weird about. So I found that this is useful if you have labels on top of. So oftentimes when you're developing media sites, you're going to have like a sidebar. You're going to have little components that have labels on them, and you don't want the labels to break into a second line. So if you have an instance in which you can't allow a label to break into a second line, then sometimes you may want to use fit text to do that. There's also a thing called fit vid. There are multiple solutions for the same thing, but you can see that this Vimeo video is scaling properly. If you tried to scale a video just using CSS and you're doing like a YouTube video, what you'll find is as you're squeezing it, depending on how you've sort of declared your properties, you'll end up with bars either on the side or the top and the bottom. You don't want that. It's not necessary. Use something that will dynamically change the, that will maintain the same ratio of your media. There's another thing developed by NPR. It actually does the same thing, but for embed codes and for graphs and things like that. It's called the pym.js. You can sort of see it in action here. You can see this graph, and as you're squeezing in, the graph actually changes. So it's super cool, and you may run into a use case where that is very useful for you. There's some more obscure responsive web design or CSS3 methodologies or approaches that you could use. I actually have no idea why CSS3 Columns have not taken over the world. I think it's a fantastic way to develop, in which in your CSS you can specify that a certain piece of content is going to be 3 columns wide at the largest width. When you squeeze down and you're on, say, like 768, that it goes to 2 columns. And when you squeeze down, it goes to 1. But the difference is that these aren't in self-contained divs. The content or the text inside will float over. So here's an example that you can see on Chris Coyer's site. So you see this live demo here. You've got 3 columns there. and you look at and just pay attention to the text as it squeezes. So the text actually shows up on the other side as it squeezes. Anyways, for the life of me, I don't understand why CSS3 Columns isn't super popular. But you know, I don't make those decisions. So Flexbox. So people have been talking about Flexbox for a couple of years now. The difference now is that most of us are using modern browsers, and these modern browsers by and large are actually saying it's ready now to use Flexbox. There's a site that you can go to called Can I Use? And if you look at the graph in the Can I Use for Flexbox, it's nearly all green, which basically means maybe we can push the envelope here. So what does Flexbox do? You can basically go to this Solve by Flexbox and you can see essentially all the things that have been solved. You can do center, you can center things vertically. And then another interesting thing is that one of the challenges in responsive web design is that, say you have a main content column and then you have a sidebar. One of the ongoing questions is like, what do I do with that sidebar? What if some of the stuff needs to float to the top above the content area and then other stuff floats underneath? Because I should be able to make those decisions. So Flexbox is one of those things that sort of says, okay, well, you can actually do your content architecture where you can say where these things fill in. So it's, you know, it basically raises the bar. It increases the complexity a little bit, but once you learn how to use Flexbox, then it becomes a very viable tool. And it is, in fact, something that people will begin pushing the envelope on very quickly, and you'll start to see sites that, you know, highly leverage Flexbox in the very near future, unless they're already doing it and I don't know about it. So also, testing responsive. Testing is pretty important because generally speaking, most people own a laptop. They might own two. They may own they may own a Mac and a PC, and they have the availability to switch between two. But generally speaking, most people are pretty limited about testing across platforms, testing across devices, and things like that. A good place to start for testing responsive is to use Browser Stack. And Microsoft has actually been nice enough to offer this thing called modern.ie, in which you can install virtual machines that will essentially represent how older browsers, i.e. 8 and up, will display the thing that you're working on. So also there's a thing called Grunt. So if you're doing a lot of you'll want to look at Grunt as a way to sort of handle a lot of the back-end tasks, like as you're updating your CSS and you'll want to look into this. It essentially handles various tasks that you would normally have to do by hand. It'll handle it automatically. So content sliders are being considered an outdated design pattern more and more, but I did want to mention some of the ones that I liked. You can spend a lot of time Googling and saying, where's a great responsive slider? What happens if I have to use a responsive slider that has multiple nodes per slide versus just one node per slide? How do I do that? Here's a pretty good place to start. You can do BQWorks, which I like. Flex Slider, JCarousel, and BX Slider are actually contrib modules, generally speaking, and you'll have to use your best judgment if you use this approach, but I actually like to build sliders using views. And generally speaking, what I'll do is I'll find a jQuery plugin that matches the business requirements that I have. I take that plugin, I rapidly prototype the slider that I'm trying to build just with HTML markup and CSS outside of Drupal, and then I'll create a view in Drupal. And I'll take that HTML, I'll take the plugin, I'll include the plugin basically using a preprocessor hook, depending on what the view name is. And I'll basically build the slider that I rapidly prototype in just HTML into the site, just using views and and the markup in the CSS. Sometimes you have to take the markup in the CSS and put it in a custom module, but generally speaking, I stay away from like the view slideshow module, and even like the flex slider module and things like that. I found that it's easier to build it from something that's rapidly prototyped yourself. But use your best judgment, and of course the flex slider and the BX slider, the jcarousel module, do exist as contrib modules in Drupal, and they're very useful. Here's some links to those. So there's a cool thing. There's a viewport calculator. If you're doing responsive design, you're going to be squeezing this thing a million times. There's a contrib module out there that will actually show you what the width of your browser is at that given time. If you're using the Chrome browser and you actually have, if you're actually inspecting an element at the time, you'll actually see, you'll see it there as well. You see it at the top there, 12. So as soon as you turn on inspect element, you should actually be able to see. I don't know if you guys can see it in the on the upper right-hand side. It shows. There's some other plugins that do the same thing. And I'll actually include the other ones that I'm aware of after the talk if you go to the GitHub repo. So for Drupal 8, I'm developing a theme called Awesome. It's actually very, it's just in its very beginning stages, but I hope to implement some of the best practices and opinions that I have about how that works. I don't think Drupal 8 is ready for prime time yet, and I don't spend a lot of time on Drupal 8 because I'm mired in active Drupal 7 work, but I am building a Drupal 8 theme, and I'd be happy to have anyone's help and contributions with that. There's a converting a Drupal 7's theme to Drupal 8 module. I haven't developed, but I have colleagues that I work with that are contributors to the Twigify module. And it's worth mentioning that Agile Scrum development fits with responsive web design perfectly. If you've never heard of Agile, they have a manifesto in which they're saying, we are uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others to do it. Through this work, we have come to value individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation, responding to change over following a plan. The great thing that I like about working in an agile practice and doing responsive web design is this sort of iterative fashion, this feedback loop that you get into. You rapidly prototype something, you show that how it responds, you're not depending on PSDs that predetermined to you what things are supposed to look like at various breakpoints or in various devices, and you're really using your best judgment. You're given the business rules of what we're trying to accomplish, and then you put it up into something rapidly prototype, and you squeeze it, you present it to the client, you get feedback, and you make changes, you improve upon it. Doing responsive web design in a non-agile environment can be quite difficult because you're basically being held to, or you're being required to match, PSD markups and requirement documents that may not actually fit responsive as well as you'd hope. So there's some paid tools that your team may like to use. Envision app, Notable app, ProtoShare, Balsamic. These first four are all things that help you in the design phase, moving into prototyping. It allows designers and developers to share notes with each other. Jira is a software that we use. It's just a ticketing system that you can track your development across working with a team. So coming soon, I hope, as I'm developing the GitHub project, that I'll share thoughts on Agile, Scrum, also responsive menus, which I had hoped to cover, but I did not. Responsive layout examples, it'd be great, to have a library, or even share the libraries that I have of responsive layouts. And then the question to you, what tools and approaches do you like to use in responsive web design that I didn't cover, or maybe I did cover and you have other comments? None? All right. Well, that's basically my presentation. I think it's quite short, but
spot on. Spot on.
Yeah. All right. Well, I will actually just browse through the. In case you guys are interested, I'll go through the links. I didn't want to toggle back and forth. I actually thought it would take too much time to toggle back and forth between the browser and the links I was referencing. So here's the SASS website. If you want to install SASS and do start on your journey of doing CSS pre-processing. Compass, which is essentially, the way that you compile, and it also provides you mix-ins to do a bunch of great things. If you don't like to use the command line, you can grab Scout. There's a thing called Bundler, which allows you to install dependencies. Generally speaking, you'll want to be working on a project that requires it for you, to use it. Gumby, Foundation, Bootstrap are all great prototyping tools, especially if you're doing your first rapidly prototype site. Here's some mix-ins. This is the Breakpoint mix-in. It basically allows you to use shorthand for creating media queries. There's the idea of using breakpoints versus using the slicer. So here's that idea. I'll have all of this on the GitHub repo. We went through the kitchen sink stuff.
Can you use Omega 4?
What's that?
Can you use Omega 4?
Yes. 4 and 5. I think it's at 5 now.
5,
So
I
yeah.
saw 5 coming out.
Oh, no. I'm sorry. I'm thinking of Foundation 5. I have used Omega 4, yes. So Omega's great because they're a very active team, and they made a huge amount of changes in Omega 3 to Omega 4. And I actually stopped using Omega because of Omega 3. They created this concept of using zones.
Right.
They were trying to replace like the block system. It's like, I don't want to do this, so I stopped using it. But then I started using it again in Omega 4, and the reason why I say that is because it looks like they make very well considered changes. Like they did the whole zone thing and then decided, oh, this isn't pragmatic. Let's not continue forward with that. And then they went back. I like Omega and the fact that they have all the tools. You can enable live reload if you're using Omega. Omega also has the little the breakpoint indicator that you can turn off and on. Yeah.
Omega is splitting. Omega is splitting. So Omega 3 and Omega 4 are very different because one person was in charge of Omega 3, had the idea about having a lot of UI configurations. He left the project. Omega 4 was some other people that had more code-based configurations. The original person has come back to Omega and wants to have Omega 5 more like Omega 3. So people involved in Omega 4 are splitting off on his project called Con.
Called what?
Con.
All right.
So,
Nice.
in any case, there's a little bit of drama there.
It's super exciting,
solved, yeah. But just it's important to know Omega 5 will probably be different than Omega 4. So.
We'll just try to learn how to 4 Omega.
Yeah.
Yeah, command line stuff.
Can you go over a little bit of the menu part of it?
What's that?
What you have for menus as far as, did you have certain modules that you use for,
So menus are a weird question in that there's a lot of opinions about menus. Like 2 or 3 years ago, I was a huge advocate of the concept of mega menus, right? You just you hover over one and it shows like this great content, and you don't have to click through. You can go through once. But then I've sort of flipped again, in which I actually believe that as human beings, we should never have more than 7 menu items at a time. And then if you have a mega menu, and it has 30 different things in it, it's not really it doesn't service. And then there's also that technical complexity where if you're using other devices, do you show that mega menu? Is there any weight implications for it? Are we loading all those things like lazy loading or Ajax? Or is that menu loading in any device? So I sort of went backwards and I said, no, actually, I like sites that have 3 menu items in the top navigation bar. You don't have any sort of jQuery or craziness going in the content. Any article or any content that you're trying to display is like up front and center to the user, not hidden by tabs, et cetera, et cetera. But to speak to the menus thing, one of the libraries I like to go to is the code drops folks. I can't speak to any Drupal contrib module, but if you actually just look up code drops menu, see, and then you'll find different examples of menus that they create. Sometimes you can go back to Drupal.org and find that people have made contrib modules based on these libraries. And I don't know if it's a controversial methodology that I use, but generally I like to use open source jQuery contributed stuff, and I'm not necessarily sold on using the Drupal contrib, but I'll find something that says, give me the markup, give me the styles to begin with, make sure that the jQuery library is open source, and then I'll integrate that either into the template layer, into the theme directly, or I'll find some other methodology, like I'll create a custom module that generates a block, and then it's inside of that. But I found a lot of people don't necessarily agree with that approach. But my rules is essentially it has to be performant, right? It has to be configurable to the rules that the end user, the editor, or the content creator needs. So as long as I'm serving those people and that the front end, the end user that's actually viewing the site, is getting a very good performance site, then, But many of those things, the detractors would say, well, all of those things that you're doing, you should contribute them back to because oftentimes I'm doing them in 2 hours, and then those things don't end up on Drupal.org. So it's sort of a weird thing, like how do you manage that workflow? But yeah, my first instinct would say, if you're looking for a menu, go find it out, like in the worldwide internet, and then see if you can put it into the system that you're using. Which basically means I'm a little bit ignorant about I was using one called MD Mega Menu, which is a paid Drupal menu, and I know there's some others that I don't favor. I can't think of them at the moment.
There is like a responsive drop-down menu module.
A contrib module?
Yeah.
Well, the MD Mega Menu is a responsive module, but it's paid. I think it's like $8, and it's by someone. But I don't know of. Do you know of a responsive menu? That's
Like in a module or something?
Yeah.
Like that? I don't know. I mean, you don't need a module to do
Right.
responsive menus. You just need to use some CSS. Brad Frost has an excellent thing called responsive patterns. And you can find tons of examples of different ways to do things like menus. Menus and tables, I think, are particularly good on there. Because there's a lot of different approaches for those, and
Right.
some good samples. So I think the drawer approach is kind of neat.
the off canvas sliders, yeah.
Canvas layout navigation is neat. Yeah.
Yeah, and you'll often
Tons of
find.
different ways.
You'll find the CSS, these sort of frameworks will also have the solutions for you. It's like, Zerb has the drawer and the off-canvas.
I think one
menus,
really
so.
important thing to note about responsive menus is that you see all the time the 3 lines thing for menus, and user testing has shown that that is ineffective. People do not know what that means. It's much better if you have the actual word menu there.
That's what I
Or if
use,
you're
yeah.
going to have the 3 horizontal lines, have it alongside the word menu.
Right.
Like, that's what user testing is showing right now, so. Anyhow, or nav, whatever,
Yeah. Yeah, I don't like icons without explanation.
Yeah.
Yeah, when did that happen? When did the hamburger menu take over? I guess, obviously it happened because,
It's probably like a,
Yeah, I noticed they put it on.
YouTube uses it.
oh, maybe.
Once YouTube's done it, or Google's decided it's
It's true that they're using it, but I'm just saying they've done user testing, and like people, there's still lots of people who do not know what that means.
Oh,
Yeah.
To me, the biggest challenge with responsive menu is getting the rest of the team to rethink information architecture. Because I think the idea of these new navigational patterns